So we're in this Exodus series, and the story has brought us to the foot of Mount Sinai, where last week we talked about how God gave the law to the Israelites. And this week, we're going to talk about what goes hand in hand with the law, which is the covenant. The law and covenant are not two separate things, but they go together. And in order to get into that, I'm obviously going to tell a story about Frisbee, because that's the only reasonable way to start a sermon like this. It was my freshman year of college, and I was in the black and gold ballroom at St. Olaf. And I was throwing a Frisbee with a guy that I had just met. I knew his name at this point. His name was Adam. This was very early in freshman year. And you know, Adam and I, we weren't talking to one another because we were college freshman guys. We don't talk to one another. We throw things at one another. That's something guys do sometimes. Well, I'm getting to know, I'm seeing this guy, Adam, and some of the things that stood out to me when I first met him, and you know what this is like, right? You meet somebody and you immediately kind of make a first impression. Hopefully not a judgment, but sometimes the first impression is a bit of a judgment. And I grew up in a small town in the woods of northern Minnesota. So, you know, things were pretty simple up in northern Minnesota. Well, Adam was wearing this knit Abercrombie and Fitch sweater and had khaki pants on. And I remember looking at him and thinking, who's this snobby, rich, suburban kid? Because obviously if you wear an Abercrombie sweater, you're snobby and rich. I mistakenly thought to myself. So I see Adam, and I make this snap judgment. And I'm like, this is probably nobody I'm ever going to hang out with because no good. I'm confessing this to you, right? I'm admitting my judgmental attitude. Well, Adam, I would find out later, was throwing the Frisbee with me, and he actually thought somehow that I was a German foreign exchange student. I don't think I was speaking German. I don't speak German. I didn't speak German. But as we're throwing the Frisbee and misunderstanding one another, in that moment, we both established in our minds an understanding of the other person. And I think you can imagine how this goes, because you have relationships, you have friendships, you have family members, you have colleagues in which you have a thought in your head about that person. The Frisbee's that was the whole point of the Frisbee. You have a thought in your head about that person, and the way you think about them defines the type of relationship you have with them. Well, it turns out that Adam and I would eventually actually become best friends. We would, be RAs in the same dorm together junior year. We were roommates senior year. And that friendship came after we realized that something we had thought was true was false, and we changed our understanding, and the change of understanding had changed our relationship with one another. I'll bring that up because as we're going to talk about the covenant and with it the law today, what I want to bring up is the way that I think for many people, when they think about God, when they think about religion, when they talk about Christianity, a lot of us carry around in our minds, and if not you, I'm certain you know somebody in your life who carries around something in their mind that defines the way they think about their relationship with God. And if what we carry around in our minds, if what we think about God is broken somehow, it's going to impact, it's going to kind of break our ability to have a relationship with God. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with a story from the book of Genesis, a story you've maybe heard of before. It's a story of Abraham and his son Isaac. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about how that story is reflected in some of the stories and some of the relationships in our own lives. And then we're going to jump back into Exodus, and we're going to read the making of the covenant between God and Israel from Exodus 19 and 24. And then we're going to come back and finish the Abraham story, and we're going to ask ourselves, okay, if this is really true about God, what does that mean for us about the way we think about God and are in relationship with God? There's a plan. There's a little outline. If you want to follow along, there's notes in your programs. Very, very fun. Some fill in the blanks. Here we go. So in the book of Genesis, chapter 22, we get this story from about Abraham and his son Isaac, and it's one of the most, I think, heart-wrenching stories in the Bible. It's the kind of story, especially if you're a parent, that you read it and you're just like, ah. And here's how the story goes. You may remember Abraham has been a significant sort of backstory to the whole book of Exodus. And so we meet Abraham in the beginning of the book of Genesis, and God calls Abraham and says, Abraham, come here. And Abraham's like, yeah, what's up? God says, I am going to do something amazing in your life, Abraham. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to turn you, one guy, into a great nation. And Abraham's like, all right, I'm in. Sign me up. Well, what happens then is Abraham thinks to himself, and in the story it's implied, if Abraham is going to become a nation, he's going to need some kids, right? It's kind of, that's the implication. The way one guy turns into a great nation is they have kids, and the kids have kids, and the kids have kids, and, we get it, multiplication. Well, the problem is, after God makes a promise to Abraham, years go by, and years go by, and years go by. And Abraham gets a little impatient, and he tries to do a few things his own way, and it doesn't really turn out very well. But finally, Abraham has his son, Isaac. And so we get to this point in the story where we're all like, God's going to make good on his promise. Abraham had a kid. Yay, very exciting. And then the story goes, God says to Abraham, because Abraham and God have a relationship where they talk to one another. God says to Abraham, all right, Abraham, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your son, and I want you to go up to the mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. What? This is a terrible, what's going on? This is crazy. This is insane. What in the world? What kind of a God tells the guy Abraham, the son he just gave, to go and sacrifice him? And you know what Abraham does? He says, okay. And he gets a donkey, and he puts some wood on it, and he gets a knife, and he gets a rope, and he goes as though he's going to sacrifice. And I'm just like, hold on. Here are some questions that I might have asked if I had been in this situation. I might have asked, I actually don't know how to sacrifice a child to God, because that's not something like, how do you do that? Okay, much more important, why in the world, God, would you ask me to sacrifice this child that you just gave me? This makes no sense. But those questions aren't asked. Well, why in the world does Abraham not ask God, why should I do this? And how do you even do this? And what is the meaning of this? Why is it that these questions are completely absent from the story? There's a lot of different ways to look at it, but I want to focus on one thing, and that is that Abraham is having this experience around, let's going to call it 4,000 years ago. Probably more than 4,000 years ago, but the dates, it's fuzzy. That's a long time ago. And for us, in our modern day, from our mindset, if we hear something like, you should sacrifice a child, we think that is ridiculous, that is abhorrent, that's bad, that's evil. For Abraham, at that time, child sacrifice was actually a fairly common religious practice. We know from the story that Abraham was born and raised in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, and the Chaldean Empire, archaeology tells us, had child sacrifice as part of many of their different religions. And that causes us to pause here a second, and we just need to remind ourselves, super brief history of religion, right? Because again, we're way back, we're 4,000 years ago. So just imagine yourself, 4,000 years ago. Pre-scientific, we don't have any of the scientific knowledge we have. Pre-industrial, pre-agricultural. We have a whole bunch of people trying to scrape by, get a few plants to grow up out of the ground so that we can eat them, get a few animals that can survive long enough so that we can kill them and eat them. And in this pre-modern, pre-scientific, pre-agricultural world, we have this strange experience every day. We know that there's this orb of fire that crosses the sky every day. And somehow we know that if there's the right amount of light from the orb, then it's going to make the plants grow. But if there's too much, it's going to kill the plants. Every once in a while, some water falls miraculously from the heavens. Where does this water come from? This is incredible. Water falls, and if the right amount of water falls, the plants will grow, the sheep will eat, we'll have food. If not enough water falls, the plants and the animals die, and we will starve. If too much water falls, the plants and the animals die, and we won't have enough to eat. And what causes all this? What causes the sun to shine? And what causes the rain to fall? And what do we do if it doesn't? Some strange force up in the sky. All we've got is this strange force, this strange power. I mean, imagine living like we can't turn on lights if there's no light. The roofs over our head are very basic. We live in very comfortable roofs today. Back then, shelter was not nearly as secure. Food wasn't as secure. And so all we have is this strange force in the sky. And out of that came all of the many, many, many religions of that day. And every religion had a different way to convince the gods to give you the rain you needed, or the sun you needed, or the food you needed so that you lived. So Abraham lived in a world where the standard for religion, just the assumption was, there are many different gods. We've talked about this in previous weeks, right? There are many different gods. All of those gods have different sacrifices or forms of worship or rituals or requirements that those gods demand of you so that things go all right. And on top of that, the gods, they're all kind of like picky and selfish and argumentative, and they're all fighting with one another. So their attention is very difficult to get. And so your purpose as a human is to do whatever it takes to get this unpredictable, unreliable, divided attention of the gods. And we see in the history of religion how people start by going, oh, well, maybe if I take some grain and give it to the gods, then the rains will fall. Okay, well, maybe I didn't give that. Maybe I need to give enough. So maybe if I give a sheep to the gods, then maybe the rain will fall. Okay, if the sheep's not enough, what could I give? Maybe I need to give my own child to the gods, and then the rain will fall. And we see this developing in the history of religion. Actually, in many different cultures around the world, the same type of thinking happens. And here's how I might summarize it. The relationship of humans with gods throughout ancient religion is, I don't know what the gods want. And whatever they do want, the requirements change all the time anyway, or they change from God to God. And if it doesn't work, whatever I give, whatever I do, whatever I create, if it doesn't work, I just have to give more. And the real problem at the heart of it all, and we talked about this a number of weeks ago when we talked about the plagues in Exodus, these gods, they're actually pretty violent and angry and warring, so I better be sure to do whatever it takes, because otherwise the gods might smite me. And you kind of ask yourself, who would want to participate in a religion like that? Like who, why in the world, how would anybody ever concede to, let alone perpetuate and pass on generation after generation, such an awful way to live? I'll tell you who will. People who don't know any other way. There's no other options. There's no other understanding of God available. And here's one of the things that's really striking to me is we think about, so we're trying to kind of read and in our imagination get into the mindset of Abraham, and we try to imagine what it would be like for Abraham to live in a world where understanding and connecting with God is something uncertain, unpredictable, scary, always changing, and we imagine what that's like. But it turns out that what we see in the history of religion is actually the same thing we see often in relationships in our own lives. I mean, think about it. Where have you seen a relationship? And I'm sure you have. Maybe you've had a boss or a coworker who's this way. Maybe you've had a boyfriend or girlfriend this way. Maybe you're in a relationship right now that's really toxic and broken, and it's this way, where you never know what the other person wants. And the moment you think you know what they want, it seems to change. And so you're just always kind of walking around on edge, being like, oh, maybe if I just do this or do more or give them this, or maybe if I just, and at the heart of it all, you're afraid because you're like, oh, man, they're going to lose their temper and they're going to be angry at me. And we see that this messed up way to think about religion is actually what the Bible calls evidence of our fallen and broken world. It wasn't just present in religion, but it's still present in our relationships, in our societies, even in our modern world today. So who would actually want that? The only people that would want that are people who know no other option. And here's my question. Where have you encountered this in your life, maybe even now, call it to mind. Think about, where is it in your life that you've experienced, seen, felt, suffered this really broken understanding of relationship, whether with God, in some toxic form of religion, or whether in relationships, this really broken thing where it's all characterized by, I never know what's going on, and I never know what's required, and I always have to give more, and I'm always uncertain and afraid that the gods or the people or the whomever are going to be angry. Where have you seen that? I'm guessing all of us have seen that somewhere, have suffered that somehow. And I put that as the backdrop because I think that backdrop is the crucial sort of backstory to properly understanding what happens here at Mount Sinai with God and the Israelites. So, brief reminder, where have we been? In the Exodus story, just like God called Abraham, God also called the Israelites. And he said, hey, you're going to be my people, and I'm going to come down and rescue you. And people are like, sign me up. And God comes down, and he confronts Pharaoh, because the Israelites who are stuck, just like when we're stuck, they don't want to stay stuck. They want to find freedom. So God comes down, and through Moses, he confronts Pharaoh, and he overwhelms Pharaoh, and he frees the Israelites from slavery. And now from that freedom, God has brought the Israelites to Mount Sinai. And God says, okay, we're already in a relationship now, right? I brought you out of slavery. That was pretty great. This is pretty good, right? We're good. And now that we're free, now that we're here in freedom, I'm going to talk to you about what does it look like to continue living in the freedom I've already given you. And he's speaking to the Israelites who literally just spent 400 years in a religious system of many gods with different requirements where you always have to give more and you never know if you're going to get those gods' divided attention. So with that backdrop, here's what we read in Exodus, starting, we're going to read this little bit from chapter 19, and then we're going to kind of jump over 20, 21, 22, and 23, and we're going to end in 24. So they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Now, pause here, and I've met people, you've maybe met people, you've maybe thought to yourself at a different point, you've read these words, you'd be like, hold on a second. This feels like a weird contract sort of thing. This feels like a weird, like, if you do this, then I do this. Why is God making this sort of, isn't this some kind of a heavy burden? Like, why is God putting so many rules down on them? I mean, we kind of, especially younger generations, we like to shirk the rules. We like to, live, that doesn't apply to me. And here we get God saying, all right. We've got a relationship, but if you do this, then I'll do that. And that question makes sense if you live in modern America with some of the modern thoughts that we have. But if you're a person whose assumption about the gods, like Abraham's, when God said, sacrifice your son, and Abraham's like, all right, I guess that's just what you got to do because you never know what the gods want. You just got to do it. Otherwise, they're going to be angry. If that's the mindset you're in, then what we see here actually in Exodus is we meet not many gods, but we meet one God. Yahweh makes it clear again and again and again and again, there's only one God. And that one God is actually speaking with great clarity and specificity. Never before in religious history, to my knowledge, I looked, there could be some examples, but never before was there an example of a God who said, let me make it perfectly clear to you exactly how this relationship works. And not only is God, the one God, the only God, you don't have to worry about all the other ones, the one God, speaking clearly, he's actually speaking about a committed relationship. I mean, think about that. The most natural comparison we have from the text is the god of Egypt, Pharaoh. Pharaoh's a man who said to himself, actually, I'm a god, you should worship me. And what did Pharaoh do in his relationship with the Israelites? The Israelites came to Pharaoh and said, hey, will you free us? And Pharaoh's like, nah. So they came back and they're like, will you free us? And Pharaoh's like, okay, sure, I'll free you. Okay, no, just kidding, I won't free you. Okay, no, I'm going to free you. Okay, no, just kidding, I'm not going to free you. Okay, yeah, I'll free. No, just kidding, I'm not going to free you. We have the example of Pharaoh as a person set up as a god who constantly changed his mind, who is unpredictable and unreliable, and fairly uncommitted to the people that are in relationship with him. And how much more of a contrast could you get than this covenant where God says, no, let me make it perfectly clear the kind of relationship that we have. I can only imagine that the Israelites standing there would have been overwhelmed and they would have just jumped up and sign me up. This is exactly what we've been wanting all along, and we have never encountered something so beautiful as this before. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly where the story goes. So Moses went and he told the people all of the Lord's words and laws, meaning he read what we call Exodus 20, 21, 22, and 23. Moses told them all the Lord's words and laws, and they responded with one voice. Everything the Lord has said, we will do. Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. The story continues. They responded, we will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So think about this for a second. We already know that everybody gets, there's these forces up in the sky, and if I want the rain to fall and the sun to shine, I just got to try and figure out what do I need to do to get those forces, those gods to like take care of me and not ruin me. I'm just going to do whatever it takes to get them to not be mad at me. And here, for the first time in religious history, we have a God who says, no. First of all, I'm going to tell you ahead of time exactly what this relationship looks like. But second of all, I'm not just asking you to give something to me, but God says, I will actually commit as well to you. Never had the world seen a God willing to make a commitment to people. It made me think of a couple of us on staff read a book recently, sociologist Brene Brown. Anybody read Brene Brown, seen Brene Brown stuff? She writes all sorts of really great stuff. She talks about vulnerability and authenticity, and it's really great. But she wrote a book on leadership. And one of the things she talks about is in leadership, in organizational life, just like in ancient religious life, one of the worst things, I mean, you can think about this in the businesses you've been in. One of the worst things that can happen is if you don't know what your boss wants. If you don't know what your boss expects, all you do know is that your boss is probably going to get angry if they don't get what they want, even though they never told you what they wanted, right? Brene says one of the best things you can possibly give somebody is the gift of clarity, because clarity is kindness. And what do we have? We have a God revealing himself as Yahweh, the one and only God, who is making it abundantly clear to his people what it means to have a relationship with him. And not only is he making it clear, but as if that clarity weren't enough, then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instructions. I mean, we use this phrase still in English today, right? That's written in stone. And what do we mean by that? What do we mean? We mean that is as reliable, as dependable, as firm as you can get. And this reliability and clarity and dependability is not just on us, but it's God saying, I will actually do this with you. God makes a covenant. What's a covenant? A covenant is a commitment that God makes between himself and his people, and it's a commitment to relational faithfulness. And this is exactly what we're going to see throughout the rest of the story, both of Exodus and of the whole Old Testament, and even of the story of our own lives, is we know that we're going to mess up again. We know that people are going to mess up again. Israel messes up again. Come back next week. You're going to find out about Israel messing up again. Doesn't take long. And they mess up real bad. I mean, it's almost comical how bad they mess up. And it's almost comical how bad we mess up. It's comical until we actually acknowledge how tragic it is, and then we cry, and then we laugh at ourselves, and then we cry, because that's the story of our lives. It's the story of humanity, is we mess up time and time and time and time and time again. And God has said, I don't care what happens, you can know for sure that I am committed to this relationship. I don't just expect something from you, but you can expect and rely on something to me. And so that brings us back to our opening question about religion. This God who gives this big, long law, I mean, the law is big, right? And there's all sorts of requirements in the law. Like, when God is giving this law, isn't that just the problem with religion? Religion has all these requirements, and it's burdensome, and religion's oppressive, and it just ruins people's lives, and it's heavy, and it's blah, 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 blah. Isn't that what's going on here? You've heard people said, you've maybe experienced this. Actually, you've maybe been in churches where that's been said, and if so, I'm sorry. Isn't the God of Exodus and that, man, when Jesus comes, it's more of the same? Isn't it just this big problem? But in fact, when we can put ourselves back into the mindset of this people at this time, what we find out is that God's invitation to the covenant, it's not a burdensome requirement, but rather it is a compassionate provision, where for the first time ever, God says, let me tell you exactly what it looks like to be and stay in relationship with me. And why is that compassionate provision? 2 reasons. First of all, the main reason, because the Israelites have just spent 400 years in slavery, and they don't want to go back. And as we as a church have been following this journey, and we've had our own experience, it's like, you know what? I've been enslaved to this. I've been stuck in a broken relationship, and I think it's maybe my fault, or I've been stuck in self-destructive thoughts or in addictive behaviors. I've been stuck, and I finally have found freedom, but now that I've found it, I want to stay here. God, how do I stay here? Because I want to stay here, and I don't want to go back there, and there's nothing more compassionate than a God who would say, let me tell you what you need to stay in the freedom of a relationship with me. And so that comes to us. As we've been following along this story, right? We've been following along the Exodus story. And I've asked us to consider, I've said, where are you stuck in life? Maybe you're stuck because you've been resisting God, because you've been resisting the invitation that God gives of a relationship with him. Maybe you're in a relationship with God, but you're stuck because you feel like there's some patterns and some habits that you just can't let go of, and you're stuck in life. Maybe you're stuck in some thought patterns. Maybe there's a way you think about God that's really ruining, tarnishing your relationship with him. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Here's how the Abraham story continues, and it might give us a little, image. The story continues. Abraham's got the wood, and he's got the rope, and he's got the knife on a donkey, and they're going up to the mountain, and Isaac actually asks. He says, Dad, I see we're going to go offer a sacrifice. Isaac even knows at that time, that in religion you make sacrifices. He says, where are we going to get the animal for the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide the animal for the sacrifice. And they go up and they build the altar, and literally in the story, Abraham has got Isaac tied on the altar, and he's raised his hand with a knife. And we're all just sitting there being like, this can't be in the Bible. Like, wow, why is this? They covering your eyes. It's not a movie. You have to read in the book. If you cover your eyes, you can't figure out what happens, but you still have this cringe moment. And suddenly, God speaks again. God speaks again. Sorry. And let me just talk about clarity. A God who actually speaks. Like so many other ancient religions, God never speaks. You just got to guess. You're just on your own. You want to know what God wants? Good luck. Try. God speaks to Abraham and says, no, stop. And we're all like, whoo, whoo, whoo. And there's a bull in the thicket. So Abraham releases his son, brings the bull, and sacrifices. And what we see here, it would have been unbelievable. Just like all gods, this God has demanded a sacrifice. If we live in a broken and fallen world, there is some sacrifice that is necessary to account for the brokenness. So God demands, but doesn't necessarily demand. We live in a world that demands some sacrifice. But the very thing that God demands as a sacrifice is exactly what God himself provides. In every other religion, if you're going to make a sacrifice for God, you are required to provide the sacrifice that God demands. And here we meet a God who says, I will actually provide what is demanded of you. Go back to the scripture. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day, it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. And what we saw with Abraham, when God provided the ram for him to sacrifice, is what we see at Mount Sinai. How God provides the law and an invitation to the covenant, exactly what the people need to stay in the freedom they've been given. And that's exactly why we and people around the world gather on Sundays to worship, because we know that this same God is the one who said, all right, the lambs and the bulls and the temples for generations, that was fine, but I'm going to finally bring it all to its fulfillment, and I'm going to provide the once and all final sacrifice. And not only did God provide it, but God said, I'm going to be the sacrifice necessary. And God came down in the form of a human being, humbly. And though he was God and could have allegedly done whatever he wanted, he lived a life of humility and allowed himself to be broken and allowed his life to be ended on the cross. And he allowed it not simply so that he would be dead, but rather by experiencing death, he could overcome it and say to us all, once and for all, that everything required to overcome our slavery and our stuckness and the brokenness of our sin, everything that is required has already been provided. And all we have to do is ask ourselves, what am I going to do? Now, here's where we're at as a church, right? You guys have been writing on these prayer walls, and just thank you. It's stunning to me to see what you guys have written on these prayer walls, and even more so, you've turned in some of those prayer cards. If you guys don't realize this, incredible things are happening in people's lives in this room. And if you're in a place where your stuck is just getting heavier and you're like, I wish that the incredible things happening in their life could happen in my life, take courage by the knowledge that just because you don't see it now doesn't mean it won't come. We don't always know the timing, but God is working great things. And yet, the story that we see, that we're going to see in the Israelites again next week, is even when we taste the freedom that God gives us, even when we make that first decision to say, God, I'm going to put my life into your hands, I'm going to find freedom in you, we still take our eyes off Christ. I think the reason we gather every Sunday, maybe this is just barely enough to remind us as often as we need to get our eyes off of ourselves and on to Christ, right? We gather every week to remind ourselves, don't go back to the old ways, keep your eyes on Christ. Don't go back to the old ways, keep your eyes on Christ. Here's the image that came to my mind as I was thinking about how is it that we continue to embrace the free gift God gives us. There's a story, I don't remember exactly where it came from, but I'm telling it as I remember it, of some poachers who were trying to capture monkeys. And they really wanted to capture monkeys, and they came up with this trap. They'd get a jar. It probably was not this jar, but they'd get a jar. And they'd tie it to the jungle floor, and they'd put a little piece of food in it. And the monkey would come up, and they'd see the food, and they'd go, oh, there's a piece of food, and they'd stick their hand in, and they'd grab onto the food. And once they grabbed onto the food, they'd realize that their fist was stuck in the jar. Because with their hand wrapped around the food, it doesn't get out of the jar. And the poachers would come up, and sometimes they'd leave the traps for days, and they'd find the monkey stuck with its hand in a jar wrapped around a piece of food. And do you know why it was stuck? Because the monkey wouldn't let go of the food just to pull its hand back out. And I wonder if we do the same thing sometimes. We've known the freedom that God gives. We've tasted the joy of a life lived based on the love of Christ. Christ said, love others as I have loved you. And we see that and we experience it. We're like, oh my gosh, that's so much better than this messed up, broken forms of relationship and religion in the world. It's so much better. But then we go, ooh, but look at this. I kind of want this though. I kind of want this. And then we're like, oh no, what am I gonna do? And God says, you don't have to do anything. All you need to do is just let go. So here's my last question. What is it that you are holding on to that is holding you back from maybe receiving again, the free gift that God is giving? Would you pray with me? And even in this moment, I encourage you, if anything in your heart, if anything in your mind, if you've acknowledged that maybe there's an idea about God that's been a stumbling block, it's been a problem for you. Maybe you've got an idea about God that just makes it very hard for you to want to be in relationship with him. I encourage you, acknowledge that right now. Just name it so that you can be clear. If there's some attitude, some behavior, some sin or brokenness in your life that's becoming a block because, like those monkeys, you're just holding on to it tightly and you won't let go, so your hand is stuck in a jar. If that's you, right now, in your heart, in your mind, acknowledge that. And so, God, we come right now, and we all have something on our hearts. We all have something that's heavy in our lives. And we acknowledge before you these realities, these burdens we carry, these lies we believe, these sins and brokenness that we live with. We acknowledge that to you, God. Lord, I ask that we would all first know beyond a doubt that we do not need to do a thing. We need to do no work. We don't need to prove ourselves or do anything to prove ourselves to you or to earn your favor. I pray that it'd be abundantly clear from the story of Abraham, from the story of Exodus, from the truth of Christ and his resurrection, that we need do nothing to earn your favor, but rather, God, show us that you have always been lovingly reaching out to us, saying, let me provide. And with that knowledge, that we don't need to earn your grace, but rather just open our hands to receive it, Lord, whatever our fists are tightly closed around, I ask that you'd help us to let go. Simply let go of the things that are keeping us enslaved and receive instead the gift of your provision in our lives. And Christ, because of the proof and the power of your resurrection, may we in this place find a new kind of life that we can find nowhere else. I pray that that would be so, and that our lives might be lived fully and freely for you and you alone. And we pray this all in your name, Jesus. Amen.